Good day everyone. So my partner and I are here to discuss about the essay of our national hero, Dr. Jose P. Rizal, entitled The Philippines, A Century Hence. So the Philippines, A Century Hence, or Filipinos dentro de 100 años in Spanish, is a socio-political essay written in 4 parts. So the Philippines, A Century Hence, is an essay that Dr. C.P. Rizal published to forecast the future of the country within 100 years, or in which he attempted to predict the country's future. So it was written on 1889 and was published in the magazine La Solidaridad in Berlin as a series in 4 parts, as what I've mentioned before, and it was published between September 30, 1889 and February 1, 1890. So Rizal outlined several scenarios for how the Philippines might evolve over the next century, the first of which was that our country would remain a Spanish colony. So in this essay, Rizal tried to answer these following questions. First, what would be the situation of the Philippines within 100 years? Based on the title itself, The Philippines, A Century Hence, Rizal will try to respond to this question, in which he tried to predict the situation of the Philippines after 100 years. Second, will the Philippines remain as a colony of Spain or become independent? So he wondered if after 100 years, are we still a colony of Spain, or are we still under the control of the Spaniards' power, or will it become an independent completely from the governance of Spain? And third, would it be a colony of another nation? But also, he cannot avoid the fact that there will be another country who has an interest of colonizing the Philippines, which unfortunately he predicted it right. So he would answer those questions in his essay, so The Philippines, A Century Hence. So the essay starts by analyzing the various causes of the misery suffered by the Filipino people. So eventually, the first part of Rizal's essay gives an overview of the causes of the misery suffered by the Filipino people, and one of the causes identified in this article was Spain's implementation of her military policies. So this is when the Filipinos were forced before, particularly men, to join the Spanish army, and eventually it led to a rapid decrease of population in the Philippines, where poverty became more rampant and farmlands were left to wither. So families were left neglected, therefore every aspect of the life of the Filipino people was retarded. Second cause of this misery that was mentioned was deterioration and disappearance of Filipino indigenous culture. So this is very hard for our part to hear, that some of our tradition and culture are slowly deteriorating before our eyes and was replaced by a culture of a foreign land. So when the Spain came with the sword and the cross, it began the gradual destruction of the native Philippine culture, of course. So of course, the moment they colonized the country, they started to implement their own culture here in the Philippines and changed their ways of living. Even right now, we can still feel the effect of their colonization in this generation. And the last cause of the miseries that was mentioned was passivity and submissiveness to the Spanish colonizers. So during the time of the Spaniards, Filipinos became submissive, or they submitted their fate and destiny to the Spanish friars. They were afraid to voice out their grievances because once they'll do that, punishments were assured. They were silenced during the time of the Spaniards. So let's continue. One question Rizal raises in the essay is whether or not Spain can indeed prevent the progress of the Philippines, or could Spain prevent the progress of the Philippines, and how will they do it? So here are some answers or ways in preventing the Philippines to progress according to Rizal. First is keeping the people impoverished, but unfortunately, it has failed. Living a life of eternal destitution had allowed Filipinos to act on the desire for a change in their way of life. They began to explore other horizons through which they could move toward progress. Second, keeping the people uneducated and ignorant. But it had also come to no avail. National consciousness had still awakened, and great Filipino minds still emerged from the rubble. And lastly, exterminating the people as an alternative to hindering progress did not work either. The Filipino race was able to survive amidst wars and famine and became even more numerous after such catastrophes. So Spain therefore had no means to stop the progress of the country. What it needs to do is to change its colonial policies so that they are in keeping with the needs of the Philippine society and to the rising of nationalism of the people. The question then arises as to what would awaken the hearts and open the minds of the Filipino people with regards to their plight. Eventually, the natives realized that such oppression in their society by foreign colonizers must no longer be tolerated. For the second part, Rizal started his essay with a very powerful message. So, for those who have strong spirit over the liberty of the country, independence was assured. But for those who are discouraged and disillusioned by sad experiences, shall be a prison of the colony forever. It simply means that those people who strongly wishes to free its country from its colonizers, independence is already assured. While those still lived with fear and those who were afraid to take risks shall be a prison of the colony until such time. Generally, it means that you can only achieve one's greatest desire if only you have the will to do so. He then started to raise the question, what will become of the Philippines within a century? Will they continue to be a Spanish colony again? On the second part of his essay, Rizal predicted the life of the following within 100 years. For the liberal Spaniards, he said, the ethical condition of the people remained the same. For the friars and their followers, they have progressed. And for many Filipino ethics, they have retrograded. So when we say retrograded, its existence will be in full reverse, meaning the Filipino ethics will have completely different fate. In other words, they may cease to exist after a century or 100 years. So, he stated in his essay that the Filipino people have remained faithful for 3 centuries, giving up their liberty and their independence, sometimes dazzled by the hope of the paradise promised, sometimes cajoled with the friendship offered them by noble and generous people like the Spaniards. So Filipinos see them as protectors, but sooner they realize that they're exploiters and executors. Enlightenment is spreading and the persecution it suffered quickens. The invading foreigner took advantage of internecine feuds to step in the peacemaker in discord and thus after to dominate both parties and subject them to his authority. Because of that, Rizal exposed several issues that concern the country. First is the abuse of human rights. And second, the lack of freedom of press. If this state of affair continues, how will the Philippines be within a century? And he said, people start to awaken, and if the government doesn't change its acts, a revolution will occur. By answering this question technically, this part of the essay serves as the reminder for the Spaniards that once enlightenment will occur within the Filipino people, there's a possibility that the Filipinos will revolt. This doesn't only serve as a reminder, but to frighten the Spaniards of the possibilities. So, he took this opportunity to recommend on what were the right things to do to prevent the said revolution. So, he started with what do people like? So, there are 2 things he mentioned. First is a Filipino representative for the Cortes and an authorized to cry out against all kinds of abuses. Since Filipinos were oppressed to show their grievances, Rizal suggested that there must be a representative for the Cortes and an authorized to report all kinds of abuses that the Filipinos had experienced. Second, to practice their human rights. This is already understandable. With Filipinos experiencing oppression and discrimination, it's only normal for Rizal to ask for this, right? So, the possible outcomes of his suggestion would be, first, the Philippines will remain under Spanish colonization, but with more law and greater liberty. So the Philippines will still be a colony of Spain, but Filipinos will be given more freedom and laws to protect them. Second, they will declare themselves independent. So even though the Philippines will still be under the Spanish colony, Rizal suggested that the country will still declare themselves independent, however, still with Spain's control and influence. So in this part, the following situations and suggestions that Rizal has made explains that he just wanted liberty from Spaniards and not a total separation. So in his essay, we see his urge to put freedom in our land through peaceful negotiations with the Spanish government. And that is how the second part ended. And for the third and fourth part of the essay, The Philippines a Century Hence, my partner, Miss Fulvi Maaghop, will talk about that. Thank you.
Now we are on the part 3 of the Philippines a century hence. If the Philippines will remain under the control of Spain, transformation will eventually happen and will affect the people. In this case, some governors have been trying to introduce needed reforms. However, it produced scanty results for the government as well as the country. So, when we say scanty results, what was provided to the government was not enough, and some of it also caused injuries to the country or the government. Our country is the most likely reminded to Sancho Panza in Barataria Island, where he took his seat on the appointed table covered with fruits and variety of food. But when Pedro Rizal interposed, Sancho was hungry as ever. So to note, Sancho was referred to the Philippines, and Pedro Rizal is referred to the reforms given by the governors. The result is the long suffering of Sancho, who misses his liberty and ends up rebelling. In this manner, as long as the Philippines have no liberty of press, all the efforts of the colonial ministers will meet the fate like the dishes in Barataria Island. The minister who wants his reforms must begin by declaring the press in the Philippines free and by instituting Filipino delegates. So, a government that governs in a country may even dispense with the press because it is on the ground. It has eyes and ears and directly observes what is rules and administers. But a government that governs afar requires that the truth and facts reach its knowledge by every possible channel, and it may weigh and estimate them better. And this need increases when a country like Philippines is concerned. So, question: what risk does the government see in them? So, there are three risks: either that they will prove unruly, become political tremors, or act properly. So, supposing that we should yield to the most absurd pessimism and admit the insult, great for the Philippines, but still greater for Spain. Certainly, the Spanish people does not spare its blood where patriotism is concerned, but would not struggle of principles in parliament be preferable to the exchange of lands. The Spanish parliament, especially abounds in oratorical paladin, is invisible in debate. So, we see no serious reason why Philippines may not have representatives. We know that the lack of enlightenment, the indulgence, the egotism may convert reform into a harmful instrument. When the laws and the acts of officials are kept under surveillance, the word justice may cease to be a colonial jest. The things that make the English most respected in their possessions is their strict and speedy justice, so that the inhabitants repose entire confidence in the judge. Justice is a foremost virtue of the civilized races. So, in this, add other minor reforms touching commerce, agriculture, security, or individual and of property, education, and others. To recapitulate, the Philippines will remain Spanish if they enter upon the life of law and civilization, if the rights of their inhabitants are respected, if the other rights due to them are granted, if the liberal policy of the government is carried out without false interpretation. If an attempt is made to see in the islands a love to be exploited, a resource to satisfy ambitious, however great may be the loyalty of Filipinos, and it will be imposed to hinder the operations of the laws of history. Rizal implicated on this part that connection between Spain and Philippines is indeed strong, as no one can keep a constant connection under the same circumstances for the whole 3 centuries. It only implies that this essay is only made by Rizal to negotiate with the Spaniards peacefully, to allow the Filipinos to have reformation of the system that may benefit both the Spaniards and the Filipinos, even if it meant that the Philippines will remain as the colony of Spain even for another century. In part 4, it is quoted from the essays, "The existence of a foreign body within another, endowed with strength and activity, is contrary to all natural and ethical laws. Science teaches us that it is either assimilated, destroys the organism, is eliminated, or become incest. Foreign body refers to Spain. Within another refers to the Philippines." What Rizal envisioned in his essay came true. In 1898, the Americans wrestled with Spain to win the Philippines and eventually took over the country. Theirs was a reign of democracy and liberty. History does not record in its annals any lasting domination by one people over another, of different races, of the diverse usage and customs, of opposite and divergent ideas. One of the two had to yield and succumb.